Under a sky still stained by smoke, the ruins of Tokyo stretched endlessly across the horizon. It was March 1946, less than a year after the infernos that had consumed the city. From the air, pilots described it as a gray ocean of ash, miles of silence where once a city of 13 million had breathed. On the ground, the wind whispered through empty lots and skeletal remains of wooden homes. Children with hollow eyes scavenged for food in bombed-out districts, while mothers waited in long lines for a handful of rice. Japan, once proud and imperial, now seemed erased from the earth itself. But amid the wreckage, something extraordinary was about to begin, an occupation unlike any the modern world had ever seen. The first American trucks rolled into Tokyo's outskirts at dawn, their olive-drab frames glinting under a pale sun. To Japanese civilians, they looked like ghosts of the war that had just ended. For years, propaganda had warned of barbaric invaders who would burn, pillage, and enslave. Women hid their children. Men stood frozen, unable to meet the eyes of their conquerors. But instead of gunfire, came engineers. Instead of soldiers shouting orders, came men distributing bread, powdered milk, and medical kits. What was supposed to be the beginning of endless humiliation became the start of something no one had dared to imagine: renewal. The Americans arrived not merely as victors, but as builders. The occupation headquarters, established under General Douglas MacArthur, transformed Tokyo's shattered Imperial Hotel into a command center for Reconstruction. The mission was clear: rebuild a nation from the ground up, and in doing so, prevent another catastrophe born from desperation and militarism. The first directives focused on food, sanitation, and shelter, the core elements of survival. With winter approaching and disease spreading rapidly through makeshift camps, U.S. Army engineers converted abandoned factories into bread bakeries and hospitals. C-54 transport planes dropped tons of flour and medicine from Okinawa and Manila, while Japanese carpenters, under American supervision, began to raise the first temporary housing blocks from recycled timber. What astonished the Japanese most was the discipline of these foreign soldiers. They saluted their superiors with precision, spoke calmly even in chaos, and treated prisoners and civilians alike with a formality that seemed alien to wartime Japan. For many, this contradicted everything they had been taught. Rumors spread rapidly of American soldiers who shared cigarettes with beggars, who fixed a school roof in Yokohama, and who handed out chocolate to starving orphans. In a society still haunted by surrender, these gestures carried the power of myth. But rebuilding was not merely physical. It was psychological. Japan's identity lay in ruins as completely as its cities. Factories once dedicated to producing Zero fighters now stood idle, their machinery rusting under open skies. Entire industries had vanished. In the heart of Tokyo, engineers from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began mapping zones for reconstruction with Japanese urban planners. Together, they envisioned something radical: a city designed not for war, but for life. Wide boulevards replaced narrow alleys that had once trapped firebombs. Fireproof materials replaced the paper and wood of old neighborhoods. American bulldozers cleared pathways for electric trams and water lines, while Japanese laborers, many still in worn military uniforms, learned to operate foreign machinery with stoic determination. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. The same hands that had forged bombs now forged bridges. The same factories that had built engines of war now produced cement, steel girders, and tools. Within months, the blackened landscape began to change color, gray dust giving way to the ochre of fresh lumber and the shimmer of new glass. Radio towers that had once broadcast militarist slogans now carried jazz and educational programs. To the astonishment of many, American officers encouraged newspapers to reopen, even those that criticized the occupation, as long as they adhered to truth over propaganda. The freedom to speak openly, after decades of censorship, was a shock as powerful as any bomb. In Osaka, where firestorms had erased 90% of industrial districts, the first signs of recovery came through collaboration. U.S. engineers worked side by side with Japanese electricians to restore power grids. Bridges across the Yodo River, destroyed by Allied bombs, were rebuilt with American steel. The Osaka Gas Company, once targeted for its role in munitions, was repurposed under U.S. guidance to provide heating for homes and schools. For many Japanese, the transformation felt unreal. The same nation that had reduced their cities to rubble was now rebuilding them, brick by brick, light by light. The emotional dissonance was overwhelming. Old men bowed deeply before the same flag they had once cursed. Children followed American convoys, their laughter echoing across ruins that had once smelled of smoke and death. Even as grief lingered, for fathers lost at sea, for mothers buried in collapsed shelters, the people began to sense a strange truth. Survival depended on trust. Trust in the very power they had fought against. In rural Japan, U.S. agricultural teams introduced hybrid wheat and rice strains resistant to blight, stabilizing a food system near collapse. Japanese farmers, skeptical at first, found their yields doubling within months. In schools, American teachers and Japanese educators worked together to draft new curriculums, emphasizing science, civics, and peace. Textbooks that had once glorified conquest were replaced by lessons on democracy and technology. MacArthur's staff understood that rebuilding a nation meant reshaping its soul as much as its skyline. Still, suspicion lingered beneath the surface. Not everyone accepted this new order with open arms. Former soldiers, stripped of rank and honor, watched foreign troops direct traffic in cities that had once bowed to their authority. Nationalists saw the Reconstruction as humiliation, a forced dependency masquerading as generosity. Yet the evidence of change was undeniable. By the end of 1947, over half of Japan's power plants were back online. Tokyo's tram lines carried millions of passengers weekly, and clean water reached neighborhoods that had once been disease-ridden wastelands. Through it all, a quiet miracle unfolded. American and Japanese engineers shared blueprints over rice bowls. Former enemies began to laugh together over the roar of diesel engines. Where once there had been hatred, there was now problem-solving. Where once there was surrender, there was purpose. The occupation was transforming from punishment into partnership, and the world was watching closely to be why 1948, Japan's recovery had become the subject of astonished headlines abroad. The speed of its rebirth defied all precedent. Economists called it the Phoenix phenomenon. Journalists marveled that a people so recently crushed could rebuild so quickly under foreign oversight. Yet few understood the hidden forces driving this transformation, the strategic calculations, the technical marvels, and the new tools that made Reconstruction not only possible, but unstoppable. The secret was not just American generosity. It was something deeper, an invisible web of organization, machinery, and innovation that turned rubble into rhythm. Beneath the surface of humanitarian aid, the U.S. had unleashed one of the most sophisticated systems of logistical control ever seen. And in the months ahead, that unseen power would reshape Japan's destiny and the entire Pacific forever. It began not in the ruins of Tokyo, but in the humming warehouses of Yokohama. In late 1946, vast shipments of American machinery arrived under armed escort. Caterpillar bulldozers, international harvester trucks, and prefabricated steel frames designed for rapid assembly. Japanese dockworkers, once accustomed to loading torpedoes and shells, now unloaded generators, transformers, and crates marked with U.S. Army Signal Corps insignia. Few realized it at the time, but this was the true weapon of Reconstruction, not the rifle or the bomb, but the machine, the circuit, and the blueprint. Behind every ton of aid was an invisible network of logistics officers, engineers, and planners who understood that rebuilding a nation required the same precision as winning a war. At the heart of this operation stood the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP, and beneath it, a web of American agencies, the Civil Communications Section, the Economic and Scientific Section, and the Government Section, all working in relentless coordination. Their orders were clear: repair Japan's industrial base, but redesign it to serve peace. Central to this was the miracle of organization, an intricate flow of supplies, data, and labor that mirrored the same wartime systems that had sustained the Pacific offensives. The same cargo routes that once carried bombs to Saipan now delivered concrete to Yokosuka. The same codebooks that guided naval convoys were repurposed to track food distribution, fuel allotments, and steel tonnage. The most powerful symbol of this transformation came through the American engineers who worked hand in hand with Japanese technicians. Among them was Colonel William Creasy, a logistics mastermind from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who had overseen pontoon bridge networks in France. Now he applied those same methods to Tokyo's shattered bridges. His teams introduced modular truss designs, lightweight, interlocking sections that could be assembled without cranes. Within weeks, traffic moved again across the Sumida River. It wasn't just engineering. It was psychological warfare in reverse, restoring movement to a nation paralyzed by defeat. Meanwhile, in Osaka, the Nakajima Aircraft Factory, once Japan's largest producer of fighter planes, was converted into the Sumitomo Electrical Works, under supervision from American industrial advisors. They stripped the facility of its weaponized machinery, retooled assembly lines, and introduced U.S. management systems based on time motion studies and quality control. American engineer W. Edwards Deming, later famous for revolutionizing Japanese manufacturing, began lecturing local foremen on statistical process control and defect reduction. To the astonishment of his audience, he spoke not of punishment, but of precision, efficiency, and pride in craftsmanship. The seeds of Japan's post-war economic miracle were quietly planted in those dusty workshops. But the most crucial technological edge came from an unexpected source: communication. When the war ended, Japan's telephone and radio networks were in ruins. The U.S. Signal Corps saw opportunity. Drawing on wartime innovations in field radio, engineers from Motorola and RCA installed a national network of VHF transmitters. These systems, initially designed to coordinate U.S. troop convoys, now carried messages between Reconstruction offices, factories, and rail hubs. For the first time in history, Japan's entire industrial apparatus could communicate in real time. Information, not ideology, became the new power. On the ground, this network translated into miracles of coordination. In Sapporo, food shipments from Hokkaido's farms were tracked by American radio dispatchers who relayed delivery schedules to Tokyo warehouses. In Nagoya, freight trains carrying cement and steel were synchronized through teletype systems salvaged from U.S. Navy surplus. Every ton of material, every kilowatt of power was accounted for, measured, and redirected to where it mattered most. Engineers began to call it the American rhythm, a constant pulse of movement and efficiency that slowly began to beat through the veins of a devastated nation. Even the Japanese themselves were astonished. Diaries recovered from the period described the disbelief of local officials who had expected chaos, only to witness near military precision in the rebuilding effort. "They work as if the war never happened," one Tokyo clerk wrote. "They count every bolt, every nail, every hour." It was not simply the resources America brought that made the difference, but the system itself, a disciplined, industrial choreography that turned scarcity into productivity. As the Reconstruction accelerated, attention turned to Japan's infrastructure, railways, power, and housing. American civil engineer Major Ralph Hewitt led the campaign to restore Japan's railway grid. Using prefabricated track sections and reconditioned locomotives from the U.S. Midwest, his teams reopened the Tokyo-Kyoto line by spring 1947. The trains, painted in bright cream and red, became moving symbols of renewal. In one striking moment captured by newsreel cameras, Japanese schoolchildren lined the platforms, waving paper flags as the first post-war express thundered past. For them, it was not just a train, it was proof that life could move forward again. Meanwhile, in the laboratories of Kyoto University, American scientists collaborated with Japanese professors to revive research institutions that had survived the bombings. Laboratories once devoted to weapon physics now studied civilian electronics and materials science. The collaboration produced early advances in transistor technology and ceramics, fields that would later fuel Japan's rise in global industry. But in 1947, these were fragile beginnings, sparks of knowledge flickering in the ruins. Not everything went smoothly. Corruption, black markets, and shortages plagued the early years. American officers clashed with local bureaucrats over priorities. Some towns received surplus jeeps before they had clean water. Others built new roads while people still lived in tents. Yet the scale of progress remained astonishing. Between 1946 and 1949, Japan's industrial output tripled. Steel production rose from less than 1 million tons to nearly 5. The Reconstruction budget, backed by U.S. loans and the Marshall Plan's Asian counterpart, funneled billions into rebuilding docks, factories, and power grids. As cities rose, so did hope, but also dependence. For every bridge that reopened, Japan leaned further on American aid and expertise. The fear among U.S. planners was that if Japan's recovery failed, communism might fill the void. The Reconstruction was not charity. It was strategy. Every power plant lit in Yokohama was a beacon against Soviet influence in the Pacific. The engineers and administrators who worked tirelessly knew that behind their humanitarian mission lay a geopolitical one. By 1949, the transformation was undeniable. Tokyo's skyline bristled with cranes and scaffolding. Department stores reopened, selling radios and bicycles instead of ration books. Neon lights flickered over the Ginza district for the first time in years, drawing crowds who stood silently, watching the colors shimmer in disbelief. For many, it was like seeing civilization reborn from its own ashes. But beneath the glow, something deeper was happening, a shift in identity. The Japanese were not merely being rebuilt. They were learning to rebuild themselves. American tools fell into Japanese hands. Systems once foreign became second nature. Factories that had been silent for years now roared with activity, not for conquest, but for creation. Yet behind the optimism lingered a question no one dared to ask aloud. What would happen when the Americans finally left? In the years to come, the answer would redefine not only Japan's fate, but the very concept of victory itself, a transformation where machines, minds, and morality converged into something greater than occupation, rebirth. By 1950, Japan no longer resembled the wasteland it had been just 5 years earlier. Cities once flattened by bombs now gleamed with concrete, glass, and steel. Streetcars rattled down rebuilt avenues lined with neon signs, the air buzzing not with despair, but with commerce. To an American visitor stepping off a transport plane at Haneda, it felt less like an occupied territory and more like a miracle unfolding in slow motion. Yet behind this transformation lay not just engineering skill, but a profound psychological shift, a deliberate effort to rebuild the Japanese spirit as carefully as its cities. The center of that transformation stood General Douglas MacArthur, a figure both commanding and enigmatic. To many Japanese, he was almost mythic, the blue-eyed shogun who appeared to rule with divine authority, yet spoke of democracy, peace, and freedom. Under his watch, a constitution was drafted that renounced war itself. The act of rebuilding became not just physical labor, but moral instruction. Factories reopened under strict oversight, schools taught civic values alongside mathematics, and newspapers printed and censored truths for the first time in a generation. The fear that had once gripped the population began to fade, replaced by curiosity, then respect, and finally an unexpected form of admiration. Still, beneath the progress ran deep currents of emotion. Many Japanese carried silent shame for the devastation wrought in their name. Others bore resentment toward their conquerors, even as they depended on them for survival. In the industrial districts of Kobe and Nagoya, former imperial officers found themselves working as laborers under the supervision of American foremen. Yet, slowly, those same men began to rediscover dignity in rebuilding rather than destroying. They learned efficiency from American methods, then improved upon them with relentless discipline. What had begun as foreign tutelage evolved into partnership, and soon, into mastery. As Japan's economy began to stabilize, something extraordinary happened. The lines between occupier and occupied started to blur. American engineers married Japanese interpreters. U.S. soldiers taught baseball to schoolchildren. Jazz floated from cafes rebuilt out of bomb cellars. The psychological wall between victor and vanquished began to crumble, replaced by an unlikely sense of shared purpose. Both nations, in their own way, needed redemption. The Americans for unleashing such destruction, the Japanese for causing it. Reconstruction became their common language. The American approach had been revolutionary. Instead of dismantling Japan's industry, as some early planners had proposed, the U.S. turned it into a cornerstone of stability in Asia. Washington understood that feeding, housing, and educating millions of people would mean little without giving them work. Factories were not merely repaired, they were modernized. Engineers from General Electric, Westinghouse, and Ford quietly arrived to advise on power systems, assembly lines, and export standards. In Kawasaki, workers began producing locomotives under license. In Yokosuka, shipyards shifted from warships to freighters. Japan was being reshaped into an economic fortress, one that would defend against poverty, chaos, and communism alike. But perhaps the most profound change was invisible: trust. For the first time in modern history, the Japanese government found itself cooperating with a foreign power not out of fear, but mutual interest. Local mayors worked with U.S. officers to plan city grids. Teachers embraced American education models emphasizing individuality over obedience. Doctors trained in American medical facilities returned home with new techniques, saving lives once lost to epidemics. This fusion of Japanese precision and American innovation created a synergy the world had never seen, and it worked. Between 1948 and 1951, Japan's industrial output doubled again. Textile exports revived, ships left Yokohama's harbor bound for Singapore and Seattle, and radios built in Osaka began appearing in homes across Asia. The Japanese worker, disciplined, skilled, and endlessly resourceful, became the quiet engine of recovery. For every ton of steel produced, there was a story of human endurance behind it. The widow who returned to work in a rebuilt mill, the student who studied engineering by candlelight, and the child who sold newspapers printed on recycled paper. The war had destroyed their cities, but it had not broken their will. Psychologists studying the occupation later observed a remarkable phenomenon. Instead of resistance or rebellion, Japan underwent what they called cooperative transformation. The trauma of defeat had forced a collective introspection. When the Americans rebuilt, the Japanese responded not with submission, but with resolve. Every repaired bridge, every lit street, became a symbol of shared humanity. Soldiers who had once faced each other across Pacific battlefields now drank tea together in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Cities that had become shrines to both tragedy and rebirth. As the Cold War deepened, Japan's recovery took on a new urgency. The outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 turned the islands into a logistical hub for U.S. forces in Asia. Overnight, dormant factories roared to life, producing uniforms, vehicles, and radio parts. This special procurements boom injected billions into Japan's economy, accelerating Reconstruction to unprecedented levels. Ironically, war in another country completed Japan's transition from ruin to powerhouse. By 1952, the U.S. occupation formally ended. MacArthur departed, leaving behind not a colony, but a partner. The rising sun once more climbed above the Pacific, this time shining not from imperial ambition, but from industrial brilliance. Yet, even as prosperity returned, the scars of the past remained visible. Elderly survivors of Tokyo's firebombings still clutched photographs of lost families. In Hiroshima, the shadow of the atomic blast was etched into stone walls as a permanent reminder of the cost of hubris. But out of that pain grew a national philosophy of peace and progress. Japan began to see its recovery not as an American gift, but as a duty to humanity. Proof that even total destruction could be overcome by discipline, humility, and collective purpose. When American journalists returned years later, they were stunned by what they saw. Streets once littered with rubble now pulsed with life. Children wore bright uniforms and carried textbooks printed in color. Factories hummed 24 hours a day. The smell of diesel, steel, and fried noodles replaced that of smoke and ash. The Japanese people, once terrified of their conquerors, now greeted visiting Americans with open smiles. And yet, behind those smiles lay a quiet understanding that history had bound them together in a way no peace treaty ever could. America had rebuilt Japan, but Japan had rebuilt something greater in return: faith in the possibility of renewal. The alliance born from ruin would go on to define an era, shaping the balance of power in the Pacific for generations. As night fell over the neon avenues of post-war Tokyo, an old man stood watching trains pass under newly built bridges. The city glowed around him, alive, defiant, and eternal. He remembered the fires, the hunger, and the shame. And then he whispered words later recorded in a local paper. Half prayer and half prophecy. They destroyed our walls, but gave us the tools to rebuild our souls. In the end, the story of Japan's rebirth was not just about technology, politics, or strategy. It was about the human will to rise, even from total ruin. The war had proven mankind's power to destroy. The Reconstruction proved its power to heal. And as dawn broke over the Pacific, one truth stood clear. In the ashes of defeat, the strongest nations are not those that conquer others, but those that learn to rebuild themselves.